This video is intended for people who have already built a plane or two, but they might not work very well and you're looking to improve them. This is not a tutorial on how to make your first plane with Clockwork. Later in the video, I'll be going over some more advanced concepts for people who want to use their plane in a competitive setting. So the most common mistake that players make when making their first plane is that they are simply too big, and this is a problem for two reasons, one of which we'll get into later in the video. The first reason is known as the square cube law, and for the sake of demonstration, here we'll have a plane with an equal ratio 1-to-1 of blocks and wings. But if we scale up the size by a factor of 3, we can set the number of blocks, and in turn the weight of the plane goes up by a factor of 27. And this is because that is 3 cubed. When you make something 3 times longer, you're also making it 3 times wider and taller. But because wings are flat, the amount of control surface you get actually only goes up by a factor of 9. So this is why it's generally better to have a smaller plane if you're looking for maneuverability. And we can see that the best flying planes around are generally around 20 to 30 blocks long. And luckily, this issue is really easily fixed. Obviously, you just have to make your plane a little bit smaller when you're building it. Now the next issue is that these planes are too slow, which makes your plane turn slower. And we can demonstrate this really simply with a setup like this. Here we have some flaps that represent the flaps on your plane. This light piece of glass represents slow moving air hitting your flaps. And you can see that the device turns pretty slowly. But this heavy piece of netherite, when it hits the flaps, turns the device much faster. When your plane is traveling faster, air hits the flaps harder and makes it turn more. Many players are actually aware of this issue but don't know how to solve it. If you're using a plane with afterblazers, then of course you can just add more. But a lot of first planes are propeller planes, and there are two ways here that we can make them go faster. First is to, of course, speed up the propeller. So how can we do this? The combustion engine in Clockwork runs at 64 RPM, which is not very fast. Something a lot of players don't consider, especially if you're new to Create, is that they can use the rotational speed controller. This block from base Create is really compact and lets you set the RPM to whatever you want. The next option for speeding up your propeller plane is to add more sails to the propeller. However, a lot of players make another common mistake while doing this. We can see here that these two carts have the same amount of sails on each propeller, with the only difference being the shape. Yet, as we run them down the track, one of them is noticeably faster than the other one. Now, why is this? Well, it turns out that the amount of thrust a propeller gives is not directly proportional to the amount of sails on it. If a sail block is surrounded on one or more sides by more sails, then it will not produce as much thrust. The more sides it is surrounded on, the less thrust it will provide. In the case of the square propeller, a lot of these sails are surrounded on 3 or even 4 sides. But in the cross shape, they are surrounded by at most 2 sides. So despite having the same number of sails, the configuration makes a big difference. It's important to note that this applies vertically as well, so some of these sails in the middle are actually surrounded on 5 or 6 sides. The first concept here is center of mass, and basically we just want to move the center of mass of our plane as far forward as possible. To demonstrate, we have this little setup here in which the propeller represents the elevators of a plane, trying to push the tail up or down. As you can see, when the center of mass is close to the elevators, or in this case the propeller, it turns very slowly. But when we move the center of mass to the other end of the plane, it turns much faster. This is the reason why elevators are always the last thing on the very back of the plane, and sometimes they even extend farther out than the fuselage of the plane itself, so that they are as far away from the center of mass as possible. Another killer of performance is having stationary flaps close to or even attached to your elevators. This does not apply to ailerons, however there are other issues to look out for with ailerons that we will discuss later. To demonstrate, we have this device which simulates 2 flying planes. One of them has extra flaps in front of the simulated elevator and the other one does not. The elevator with no additional flaps turns itself quite a bit, but the elevator with additional flaps struggles to turn itself as much or as fast. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how having a smaller plane makes it easier to turn, specifically with regards to rolling. Planes with large wingspans like the AC-130 and B-2 bomber cannot roll effectively, despite having huge control surfaces. This is because the part of the wing on the very edge moves much faster than the inside of the wing, which means it has exponentially more drag as you increase wingspan. To demonstrate, we once again have this little contraption in which we have some flaps, either very close to the center of rotation or on the very edges. And you can very clearly see just how much of a difference it makes. On this setup, there was a full 60% increase in rotation speed. So we want to optimally keep our planes as skinny as possible. However, your elevators want your plane to be as short as possible. So assuming you want to keep the same number of wings and flaps, then you have to come up with some kind of compromise. So while it may seem like the solution is to have as few wings as possible, you should hopefully realize that having a lower wing loading actually allows you to perform a steeper turn. So there's a certain balance to be struck with every design. One thing that even experienced players neglect is the control scheme. On a plane, you normally have something like 4 control surfaces, which can turn in 2 directions each. So if you're not fully utilizing your control surfaces, then you're giving up performance. Here we can see that the elevators assist with rolling when they're not pitching, and that the vertical stabilizers fold away so that they don't hinder the elevators. So that was my quick guide on how to improve your plane in Clockwork, and I hope you found it useful.